The doctors told Ace Frehley he was finished. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold a guitar pick, and the withdrawal symptoms were making him see things that weren't there. But when he heard something unexpected through his hotel room wall, he made a decision that nearly killed him and changed rock history forever. It was August 17, 1982, at the Holiday Inn in Detroit, Michigan. Ace was scheduled to record what would become his final solo tracks before officially leaving Kiss. The session at United Sound Systems studio was supposed to start at 8 p.m., but in room 347, the Space Ace was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with music. Ace was dying. Not literally dying, but his body was shutting down from years of alcohol and substance abuse. He'd been trying to detox on his own for 3 days, a dangerous decision that nearly cost him everything. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His temperature spiked between chills and fever, and the hallucinations, they were getting worse by the hour. For 72 hours, Ace had been locked in that hotel room, sweating through sheets, fighting demons both real and imagined. The withdrawal was so severe that he was seeing his younger self standing in the corner, wearing the silver Space Ace makeup, staring at him with judgment and disappointment. At one point, he believed Gene Simmons was in the room, telling him he'd always been the weak link in Kiss. The visions felt absolutely real. Eddie Solon, his longtime guitar tech and one of his few remaining friends who hadn't abandoned him during the spiral, had been checking on him every few hours. Eddie later revealed that Ace's condition was terrifying. His skin had a gray pallor, his eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, and he barely recognized where he was. Eddie had begged him to go to the hospital, but Ace refused. He was convinced that if word got out about his condition, it would be the final nail in his coffin with Kiss management. At 6 p.m., 2 hours before the session was supposed to start, the producer called the hotel. The studio was ready, the session musicians were warming up, and the clock was ticking on expensive studio time. But Ace couldn't even stand without holding on to furniture. Eddie told the producer they needed to cancel. Ace was in no condition to play guitar, let alone record. That's when something unexpected happened. Through the thin hotel walls, Ace heard a sound that cut through his withdrawal-induced fog. It was coming from the room next door. Someone was playing a guitar. Not just any guitar playing, but someone was practicing the opening riff to Shock Me, one of Ace's signature songs from Kiss. The tone was wrong, the timing was slightly off, but the passion was unmistakable. An unexpected connection. Ace, even in his deteriorating state, felt something stir inside him. That song, the first one he'd ever sung lead vocals on with Kiss, had been his breakthrough moment. Hearing someone else attempt it, struggling with the same technical challenges he'd once mastered, created a strange connection across that hotel wall. Eddie watched as Ace pulled himself up from the bed where he'd been lying for hours. Ace stumbled to the wall and pressed his ear against it. The guitar player next door was now attempting the solo section, the part where Ace had originally used his signature Les Paul tone to create that iconic, spacey, melodic sound. The unknown guitarist was having trouble with the bends, the same bends that thousands of young players had struggled with since 1977. Without thinking, still wearing sweat-soaked clothes and barely able to stand steady, Ace knocked on the wall 3 times. A rhythm. The guitar playing stopped immediately. There was silence for a moment. Then 3 knocks came back. Then the guitar started again, but this time playing the riff slower, as if asking a question. Ace turned to Eddie with eyes that were still bright with fever and withdrawal, but suddenly clear with something else. Something Eddie hadn't seen in months. Purpose. "Get my guitar," Ace said, his voice rough but determined. The Les Paul and the small practice amp. Eddie stared at him in disbelief. Ace, you can barely stand. You're supposed to be in the studio in 2 hours, and you can't even... I said, get my guitar. What happened next defied every medical and practical consideration. Eddie, against his better judgment, retrieved Ace's 1974 Gibson Les Paul Custom from its case, the guitar that had been with him through Kiss's greatest tours, through solo success, through everything. Ace's hands were shaking so badly that he dropped the pick twice before finally managing to hold it. But then he played a single note. Just one. The muscle memory was still there, buried beneath the tremors and the sickness. That note rang out through the small practice amp, and immediately the guitar player next door stopped playing. There was a moment of absolute silence. Then Ace played the opening riff to Shock Me the way it was meant to be played. Clean, precise, with that signature Ace Frehley tone that had inspired a generation. What followed was something that Eddie Solon would later describe as the most surreal musical experience of his life. For the next hour, Ace Frehley and the unknown guitarist in the next room communicated through the hotel wall. No words. Just guitar. The stranger would play a riff, make a mistake, and Ace would play it back correctly, showing him how it should sound. Then they'd play together, separated by drywall and circumstance, but connected through the universal language of rock and roll. The physical act of playing seemed to be doing something to Ace's body. The tremors in his hands began to calm when they were focused on the fretboard. The hallucinations receded when his mind was occupied with musical problems to solve. It was as if the guitar itself was medicine, pulling him back from the edge of whatever abyss he'd been approaching. At one point, Eddie heard voices through the wall. The guitar player next door had friends with him, and they'd realized who was playing on the other side. Through the wall, muffled but clear, Eddie heard someone say, "Holy shit, that's Ace Frehley. That's actually him." When 7:30 p.m. arrived, something impossible had happened. Ace was standing, dressed in clean clothes that Eddie had helped him into, holding his Les Paul like it was a lifeline. He was still sick, still experiencing withdrawal symptoms, but something had shifted. The connection through that wall had reminded him of why he'd picked up a guitar in the first place. Not for Kiss, not for fame, not for the Space Ace character. For the pure, simple act of making music and connecting with other people through it. The drive to United Sound Systems studio was terrifying. Ace had to pull over twice because of dizziness. But each time he'd grip the steering wheel, think about that unknown guitarist in the hotel room, and find the strength to continue. That kid practicing his songs, struggling with his techniques, represented every young player who'd ever been inspired by his work. How could he give up when people like that still existed? When Ace walked into the studio, the session musicians immediately knew something was wrong. His usual confident swagger was replaced by a careful, almost fragile walk. His skin was still pale, and his hands occasionally trembled when he wasn't holding his guitar. But there was something in his eyes that surprised everyone who knew him. Determination mixed with a kind of desperate clarity. "I know I look like hell," Ace said to the room, "and I am, but we're going to make something real tonight." What followed was medically improbable and artistically transcendent. Despite his withdrawal symptoms, despite his physical weakness, Ace began to play with an emotional rawness that nobody in that studio had heard from him before. It was as if all the protective layers he'd built up over years of being Space Ace, of being the cool, mysterious Kiss member, had been stripped away by his physical crisis, leaving only the pure essence of Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, who'd fallen in love with guitar as a teenager. The first track they attempted was a new song Ace had been working on, something personal that had nothing to do with Kiss's commercial sound. When he played the opening riff, his hands were steady for the first time in days. The withdrawal symptoms didn't disappear, but when his fingers were on the fretboard, when he was lost in the music, they receded into the background. But halfway through the first take, something went wrong. Ace's hands started shaking again, violently. He missed a chord change, then another. The producer was about to call a break when Ace did something unexpected. Instead of stopping, instead of apologizing, he kept playing. He incorporated the shaking into the performance, bending notes in ways he'd never done before, creating a sound that was raw and imperfect, but devastatingly honest. The engineer, who'd worked with everyone from Stevie Wonder to the Stooges in that historic studio, later said that watching Ace Frehley play through his withdrawal symptoms was like watching someone fight for their artistic soul in real time. He wasn't trying to be perfect. He was trying to be real, and that desperation created something more powerful than technical perfection ever could. About 45 minutes into the session, the inevitable happened. Ace's body, pushed beyond its limits, simply gave out. He didn't collapse dramatically. He just slowly sat down on the studio floor, his Les Paul still in his lap, unable to continue standing. Eddie rushed over, but Ace waved him away. "I just need a minute," Ace said into the studio talkback microphone. "Keep the tape rolling." And sitting there on the floor of United Sound System Studio, in the same room where Marvin Gaye had recorded What's Going On, and Aretha Franklin had laid down legendary tracks, Ace Frehley did something he'd never done in a professional recording setting. He began to talk, really talk, about what he was feeling. The tape captured everything. Ace talking about how the Space Ace character had become a prison, about how Kiss's success had given him everything except the freedom to be himself, about how the substances that were now destroying him had started as a way to cope with the pressure of being someone he wasn't, about how he'd forgotten, somewhere along the way, that he'd started playing guitar simply because he loved the sound it made. The session musicians didn't know what to do. This wasn't normal studio behavior. But the producer, sensing something important was happening, kept the tape rolling. Sometimes the most powerful music comes from the moments between the songs, from the raw honesty that emerges when someone's defenses are completely down. After about 10 minutes of this unexpected catharsis, something remarkable happened. Ace stood up. Not slowly, not carefully, but with sudden energy. The physical and emotional release seemed to have given him a second wind, or maybe just reminded him of what he was fighting for. "Let's try that again," Ace said, "and this time, I'm going to play it like I mean it." What followed was extraordinary. The song they'd been struggling with came together in a single take. But it wasn't technically perfect, and that was exactly what made it powerful. You could hear Ace's struggle in every note, his determination in every chord change, his humanity in every slight imperfection. It was the sound of someone fighting their way back from the edge, not through superhuman strength, but through the simple act of doing what they loved most. The session that was supposed to last 3 hours went on for nearly 6. Ace kept adding tracks, trying new ideas, pushing himself further than anyone thought possible given his condition. It was as if he was trying to prove something, not to Kiss, or to critics, or to fans, but to himself. That he was more than Space Ace, that Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx still existed underneath all the makeup and costumes and expectations. During one particularly intense moment, while laying down a guitar solo, Ace closed his eyes and played with such emotional intensity that everyone in the studio fell completely silent. The engineer later said you could feel the weight of everything Ace was going through in that performance. Years of pressure, years of living behind a mask, years of slow self-destruction, all pouring out through a 1974 Gibson Les Paul. Around 2 a.m., something unexpected happened. Ace's withdrawal symptoms began to ease. Not disappear, medical science doesn't work that way, but the combination of physical exertion, emotional catharsis, and the focusing power of creative work seemed to give his body and mind something to fight for rather than against. The tremors became less frequent. The hallucinations stopped. The clarity that had been fleeting became more sustained. Medical experts who later heard about that night suggested that intense creative focus can sometimes help people through the worst phases of withdrawal by giving the brain something constructive to concentrate on. The act of playing guitar, of solving musical problems, of creating something beautiful, activated different neural pathways than the ones screaming for substances. When Ace finally left United Sound System studio as the sun was rising over Detroit, he was a different person than the one who'd walked in 8 hours earlier. He was still sick, still facing a long road to recovery, but he'd proven something crucial to himself. That music, the pure act of creating it, was more powerful than any drug. That his identity as a guitarist existed independent of Kiss, independent of Space Ace, independent of everything except his connection to the instrument. Eddie Solon drove him back to the Holiday Inn as morning light broke over the city. When they got to room 347, Ace did something unexpected. Instead of going to his room, he knocked on the door next door. The door where the unknown guitarist had been practicing Shock Me the night before. A young man answered, maybe 19 years old, holding a beaten-up Stratocaster. His eyes went wide when he saw Ace Frehley standing there, still pale and worn out, but somehow present in a way that the kid could sense was rare. "You're the one who was playing last night," Ace said. It wasn't a question. The kid nodded, speechless. "Keep practicing," Ace told him. "And remember something. The guitar doesn't care if you're famous or not, if you're sick or healthy, if you're perfect or broken. It just wants you to be honest. That's the only thing that matters." The kid would later tell this story to guitar magazines describing how Ace Frehley, at what appeared to be his lowest point, had somehow found the strength to encourage a stranger. That brief interaction, that moment of passing the torch from one generation to the next, became part of rock folklore. For Ace personally, that night in Detroit became a turning point. Not because it solved all his problems or ended his struggles, those would continue for years, but because it reminded him of something he'd forgotten, that his value as a musician wasn't tied to Kiss, to commercial success, to being Space Ace. It was tied to the simple, pure act of creating music and connecting with other people through it. The aftermath and legacy. The recordings from that August night were never officially released. They existed in the United Sound System's archive, rough mixes that captured one of rock music's most iconic guitarists at his most vulnerable and most authentic. But bootleg copies circulated among collectors, prized not for their technical perfection, but for their raw emotional power. You can hear Ace's struggle in every note, his redemption in every successful chord change, his humanity in every imperfection. The session became legendary among studio musicians and producers who worked with Ace afterward. It represented a shift in his artistic approach. He became less concerned with maintaining the space ace image and more interested in honest musical expression. The guitar solos on his later solo albums, particularly on Frehley's Comet records, had a rawness and authenticity that connected with audiences in ways his more polished Kiss work sometimes didn't. Years later, in interviews about his recovery and his journey away from Kiss, Ace would occasionally reference that night in Detroit. He never went into full detail, maintaining some privacy about his darkest moments. But he would say that there was a recording session where he learned that music could be medicine, that creation could be healing, that sometimes your worst moments can teach you your most important lessons. The story of Ace Frehley's crisis session reminds us that artistic authenticity often comes from our most vulnerable moments. When Ace stopped trying to be the invincible space ace and allowed himself to be the struggling human Paul Daniel Frehley, he created something more powerful than any technically perfect performance could achieve. It showed that sometimes our limitations aren't obstacles to overcome, but gateways to a deeper truth about who we are and what we're capable of when we embrace our humanity, rather than fighting it. It also reveals the healing power of creative work and human connection. That unknown guitarist practicing through the hotel wall, that brief musical conversation between strangers, became the catalyst that pulled Ace back from the edge. Not through intervention or lectures or medical treatment, though those would come later, but through a simple reminder of why he'd fallen in love with guitar in the first place. And maybe that's the real lesson of that August night in Detroit. Not that Ace overcame his crisis to record, but that he allowed his crisis to strip away everything false about his artistic persona and reveal the healing power of authentic musical expression. The Space Ace mask had served its purpose in Kiss's theatrical rock spectacle. But the real Ace Frehley, the guitarist from the Bronx who just wanted to make honest music, was always more powerful than any character he could play. The young guitarist in that hotel room represented something crucial. Every musician who'd been inspired by Ace's work, who'd struggled to learn his solos, who'd tried to capture his tone. They weren't fans of Space Ace, the character. They were admirers of Ace Frehley, the guitarist, the human being who could make a Gibson Les Paul sing in ways that touched people's souls. That night in Detroit, Ace remembered the difference. And that memory, that return to authentic musical purpose, became more valuable than any Kiss reunion or commercial success could ever be. Today, that session exists as a reminder that sometimes the performances that matter most aren't the ones in front of thousands of people. Sometimes they're the ones in small studios at 2 a.m., when you're fighting for your artistic soul and playing for an audience of 5 people in posterity. Sometimes they're the ones where you're barely holding it together, but you're finally, completely, devastatingly honest. Ace Frehley performed thousands of shows with Kiss and recorded countless tracks. But the night his body was breaking down from withdrawal became the night he recorded his most honest music. It proves that strength doesn't always mean invincibility. Sometimes the greatest strength is admitting weakness, embracing vulnerability, and finding healing through the work you love most.